Welcome to JHart Modelworks. Next on the Tamiya 124 scale Alpine Renault A110, we'll be knocking out all the running gear for the car. So the engine, suspension, frame, and chassis all need to be done in this video. Welcome to my workbench. Let's get started. I went ahead and assembled the engine, but I forgot to hit record. Basically, I just used some Tamiya Extra Thin and put together both sides of the engine block as well as the front and the bottom pieces. This way they can all be painted together. We're also going to go ahead and drill out the holes for the spark plug wires before we paint the valve cover. This way we don't run the risk of damaging the paint job drilling into a painted surface. As usual, Tamiya blessed us with ejector pin marks right in the middle of the shock springs. Do this on every kit. We'll start with our metal files, and we want to try and clean up the space between the springs without damaging the spring detail itself. Next, using a toothpick, we're going to apply a tiny bit of sprue goo to the gap in the spring. If you don't know what sprue goo is, you take bits of old sprue, you chop them up into small pieces, and you drop them into like half a bottle of Tamiya Extra Thin. You let the cement dissolve the plastic, you keep adding more to it until it turns essentially into a putty made of molten plastic. When you apply it, the cement evaporates off and you're left with styrene plastic as a filler. I don't use this stuff often, but this is a perfect use for it. There's a mold seam running along the springs, so we're going to try a tip that I saw my friend Paul from International Scale Modeler do. We're taking our Tamiya Extra Thin and we're going to brush it over the mold seam, following the direction of the springs. This is going to take a bit to do, but over time the liquid cement will melt away that raised mold seam, leaving us with a fairly clean shock absorber. That looks pretty good. We also want to glue the upper control arms for the front suspension to the frame so they can be painted all together. The exhaust tip is molded solid and it's very short and goes into a curve. We want to open this up, so we're going to start by using a jewelry awl to poke a small pilot hole as close to the center as possible. We're then going to start with our small micro bits and our pin vise, and we're going to slowly step up through the bits until we get close to the edge. We want to be very careful though, we don't want to drill all the way through and come out the other side. So just drill in a short little ways. And then towards the end, I didn't catch it on camera, but we're going to use a round metal file to just finish it off. The carburetors for this kit are beautifully detailed, but like the exhaust, the intakes are molded solid. So just like with the exhaust, we're going to start with the awl and poke some pilot points into each of the intakes as close to the center as possible. We then want to carefully drill out the opening for the intakes, being careful not to drill at an angle or possibly go through the sides. We want to start with a small bit, like maybe 0.5 millimeter, and step our way up through the bits. The end near the carb is smaller than the outer end, so be careful not to drill too wide and risk damaging the sides. We then start working on the bell or trumpet shaped ends. We start out with our round metal file, then I remembered a new tool that might make quicker work of this. These are Dremel cutting bits, but my trusty cheap black pin vise from Amazon is large enough to hold them. I'm going to put the rounded triangle bit in and we can easily cut away at the bell end. At a hand turn speed, we can easily keep an eye on how much we're cutting so we don't damage the part, and the taper keeps us from damaging the sides. And that looks about perfect. Tamiya molded the carburetors together, which is probably easier, but realistically these are not connected like this. So we're going to use our display nippers to cut them apart. We then want to carefully trim away the excess with a hobby knife. And finally, we'll clean the cut areas gently with a 400 grit thinny stick sander. With all the prep finished, we'll get the parts painted and come back for assembly. Everything's painted up, but before we start assembly, I want to put a wash on the engine block. We're going to apply a couple of different Tamiya panel liners, starting with the black. The wash will get into all the nooks and crannies and bring a lot of depth to the block. After the black, I like to follow up with some dark brown. The combination of the black and the brown gives the wash more of a greasy, oily effect. If you want, you can even add some of the regular brown as well, but I thought it was a little bit much for this car. Once the panel liner is dry, we want to take a cotton bud dipped in odorless mineral spirits and gently run over all the raised areas and large flat surfaces. The dried wash will come right off, leaving washing all those little nooks and crevices and creating lots of shadows and just a really nice effect. Now we can start assembling the engine, starting with the valve cover, which I did in a candy red, and I used a mechanical pencil dipped in silver paint to pick out all the raised details. There's a notch on the block that lines up with a tab on the cover. We want to use these to line up the parts correctly. We'll apply just a little bit of CA glue to the block and then carefully set the valve cover in place. Next, we're going to glue this little cap to the back of the alternator. I'm not even sure why this is a piece. Sometimes Tamiya just makes parts for the sake of making parts. Next, we're going to glue the belt and pulleys onto the water pump and alternator assemblies. Next, this small tab gets glued into the slot on the front of the engine. And that's as far as we can go with the engine for now. Before we can do any more, we need to get the engine mounted into the frame. We need to build all the suspension and then mount the frame up into the chassis. Then we can finish out the engine. Starting with the rear suspension, the rear shocks have a little C-clamp end that just clamps into place on the rear control arm. Now we're not going to glue these, we're just going to click them in place. Now we're going to add some glue where the control arm slides into place, and we're going to add some glue to the top of the shock. Now the control arm will slide right through this hole. And then as we press it down, we're also going to make sure that we seat the shock into the upper control arm. Now we're going to mount the engine. We'll apply some glue to the 3 mount points on the frame. Then when we press the engine in place, we want to make sure that the small locating post on top of the transmission slides firmly into the hole on the crosspiece, and that the engine mounts rest flush against the 2 side mounting tabs on the frame. Okay, next up we want to assemble the rear wheel uprights. We want to drop the poly cap into the upright, and then we can glue the brakes on, making sure to line up the key points on the 2 parts and not get glue on the poly cap. Notice I keep the side-specific pieces on either side of the frame. This spatial organization helps me make sure I don't put the pieces on the wrong sides. After assembling the other side, we need to attach the transaxles and mount the uprights to the frame. There's a couple of ways we can do this. We can glue the axle to the upright and then glue the upright onto the frame, making sure the axle lines up with the engine. Or we can glue the axle to the engine, then line the upright with the frame and the axle. The important part is that everything seats correctly and that the upright connects properly to the frame at a right angle. Repeat for the other side. The lower suspension arms and frame are a single piece, and before we can attach it, we need to glue on the rear sway bar. Just a drop of glue on the two mounting points and press it into place. There are two mount points on the front side of the frame piece, a post on the bottom of each upright that slides into a hole in the control arms, and two mount points on the rear. We want to add just a drop of glue to the front points and the upright posts first. Then we'll start by lining up the uprights and the control arms, then press the frame piece firmly into place. After that, we can lift the rear posts slightly, add a drop of glue under them, and press the rear mount points home as well. Once that's done, check the ends of your rear sway bar. They should line up right with two small posts on the back of the uprights. If not, line them up and glue them into place as well. With the rear suspension in place, we can add the headers. We'll add some glue to all four holes on the block, then we'll set the headers. All four don't really want to sit perfectly straight off, so we'll just set the first two and add a little Insta-set. Then we can nudge the second set into place and set those as well. Onto the front suspension, and this time the polycap drops into the brakes instead of the upright. We'll add some glue to the connecting edge on the upright, and then press it home to the brakes. Again, the parts are key to help you line them up correctly. Next, we want to glue the shocks to the lower control arm. There's a flat end on the shock, and that sits right into a matching slot on the control arms. Now we want to move a little quickly here. I haven't allowed the glue to fully set on the shock yet. The shock feeds to an opening in the frame and glues to the upper control arm. We're going to place some glue in the upper arm's locating point. We're going to set the front upright in place, making sure we get the connector for the steering rack facing the right direction. And then we'll add some glue on the point where the lower arm connects to the frame. We can then feed the shock through the opening and get it seated in its place, and then make sure the lower arm sets in place on the frame and the upright. Since the glue on the shock isn't fully set, we have a little wiggle to make sure we get everything lined up right. Once both sides are done, we just press the connectors for the steering bar into position on the uprights till they click, and give it a quick test wiggle to make sure everything moves properly. The last piece of the front suspension is the sway bar, and we need to set it in place on the two small mount points on the bottom of the frame. Just a little bit of glue, and we press right into place. There are four locating points to mount the frame to the chassis, two here in back and two in front. We'll start by applying some glue to the rear points first. Now we need to slide the engine and frame through the engine bay opening in the chassis so the rear lip of the frame sits on top. Then press the frame into place. There are two small holes in the chassis. Make sure the locating pins on the frame seat in the holes. Sometimes they don't want to sit correctly, but it feels like it's in. It's not. Once those holes are set, we can then gently lift the front of the frame, add a touch of glue to each of the locating points, and then press them home as well. The car has these two covers that are supposed to be painted semi-gloss black, and they cover up everything. Even if you don't paint them, they're still frosted, so you still lose most of your detail. I just decided not to use them at all. My backstory will be that they got taken off for maintenance and just never got put back on. So we'll just move on to gluing in the exhaust. I'm going to put a little glue on the end of the header and on the two mount points on the chassis, and just press it into place. I did need to wiggle the end a little bit to line it up with the headers. We'll drop a little Insta-Set in for good measure, and we're done. Next, we're going to glue in what I think is an oil cooler, that or the smallest radiator in the world. There are two mount points, but they are larger than the locating pins, so it doesn't really fit securely. It probably would have been easier to do this after the carbs, but it worked out anyhow. Speaking of the carburetors, we'll go ahead and put some glue on the ends here. And then we need to fit them into these four little holes on the intake side of the engine. The ones closer to the front were a little harder because of the chassis. The second ones just went right in. The kit does not include a distributor, but Mr. Model makes this small distributor which will fit perfectly, and it contains a photo etch top that lets you choose between 4, 6, and 8 cylinders. We're going to be using the 4-cylinder. The distributor comes with some nice plug wire. I think you're supposed to glue the photo etch cap on, then glue in the wires, but I instead ran the wires into the photo etch while it was still on the fret and easy to handle. Then I glued from the bottom, so all the glue will be hidden inside the distributor. Once I had all 5 wires glued in, I cut them off as close as possible to the cap without breaking them loose. Then I removed it from the fret and glued the cap into place in the distributor. Once dry, we can bend all the wires down to a 90-degree angle and run them through the 4-port wire loom on the photo etch fret. Then we can glue the distributor into place. It needs to sit right between the ports on the front carb. Tamiya included detail on the block for a distributor, but didn't include a distributor itself. And normally I would drill a hole to set the distributor, but the area on the block is just too small, and it's going to be covered with an interior cover anyhow, so we're just going to glue it into place on the side. To set the plug wires, we're going to run them where they need to go. We'll then cut them just past the hole in the valve cover, and then bend the excess into another 90 degree at the end. We don't want these coming up straight up out of the valve cover. These wires need to lay as flat as possible to avoid interfering with the interior cover piece later. Before doing the last 2 plugs, I ran the wires through another 2-hole wire loom. I really think wire looms improve the finished look of the engine bay. When you cut the loom off the fret, just be careful not to cut the wires, and then push the wire loom in place with some tweezers. We'll just glue the last plug wire in place. And there we go. For our last little bit of detail, we're going to take some 0.035-inch braided line from ProTech and run a fuel line to the carbs. Sadly, I don't have any of Charlie's hex fittings, but I do have some round ones from Ted's Modeling Marketplace that will fit just fine. I'm going to cut a piece of braided line long enough to run across the carbs, then wrap around the engine and head back towards the front of the engine bay to tuck in later. I'll then slide 2 of the fittings onto the braided line. This can be a little tricky, and you may need to cut the end of the line after the first one to get the second one on, but they will eventually slide over. It's better to get both fittings on now so you aren't fighting with this while one end is already glued down. Once we have both fittings on the line, we want to glue one on the very end, and then we can glue it in place over the center of the forward carburetor. With that held in place, we can add a touch of glue to the line above the second carburetor and slide the second fitting into place on the line. Then we'll just glue it down as well. Finally, we'll take the remaining line, we'll wrap it around the engine as we see in reference photos, and tuck it under the exhaust manifold. We can then pull it out the bottom, cut it down, and tuck it into place where the frame meets the chassis. Here we are, all finished, and I think that's a really easy way to add a nice bit of detail. And that's going to wrap it up for this part of the build. From here, we're going to move on to the interior. Sadly, I had to give away my color plans, but I didn't want to risk spraying the interior of the chassis with the engine in place and getting paint on the engine. I appreciate every single one of you for hanging out with me, especially those that made it this far, and I'll catch you on the next one. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. Also, feel free to leave comments, feedback, critique, or anything else in the comment section below. I enjoy interacting with all my viewers in the comment section and try to reply to all the comments I receive. If you want to catch future videos, please consider subscribing to my channel and make sure you click the bell notification icon so you can be notified when I upload new videos. As always, thank you for watching, keep modeling, and have a great day.